It's not the unvaxxed people that we should be shaming. It's our pollies and the nurses and medical unions who've let things get this bad. Our hospitals simply cannot cope. If we have a few thousand hospitalisations in an Australian state like Western Australia, South Australia, Victoria or Queensland, we are stuffed, according to the doctors, because we are simply not ready. Our ICU, our intensive care unit system, is designed to run almost at 100% capacity in peacetime. So in wartime or pandemic time, it can't cope. So why haven't they been building special annex wards and getting ventilators in and getting ready and increasing capacity? I mean, they've had 18 months, right? Well, that is a little more complex. Well, g'day and welcome to episode 65 of The Other Side Australia with Damian Coory, your dose of sanity from a sensible, balanced, classical liberal centre-right perspective. This week we debunk the myth that unvaccinated people pose more of a risk to vaccinated people than other vaccinated people do. The whole reason the government's making unvaccinated people into villains, the hospitals aren't ready. So the good news for the unvaccinated is it's not your fault and nobody has the right to shame you. The bad news is you might need to get vaccinated so you don't die because of our lousy health system. We'll explain more on all of that in a moment. Free speech has taken another hit in Australia recently with the ruling from the High Court that means whatever anyone posts commenting on your social media posts, you are liable for. Sounds absolutely crazy, but hey, this is Australia and it's true. You could get into trouble because a stranger posts something on your thread. Barrister and legal scholar Dr. Gillian Dempsey will join us for our long-form podcast interview at the end of the show on that one, and you don't want to miss it. And did you get a text from United Australia Party leader Craig Kelly? We will explain the public fight that has erupted over that text between Clive Palmer and Australia's main medicine authority. All that coming up. A former Australian Liberal Premier says that the COVID pandemic has rewritten Australian history in terms of the power balance between the federal government and the states. Former Queensland Premier Campbell Newman, who dramatically quit the Liberal National Party in Queensland recently to announce he was running for the Senate for the Liberal Democrats, has told Brisbane Radio 4BC's Neil Breen that history has been rewritten. The role of the federal government has been diminished, and Scott Morrison is to blame.
Are you worried about the balance of power in Australia? Like, you were a former Premier of this state, a long-term Lord Mayor, and all of a sudden this pandemic has shown the power the premiers have and controlling borders and all of these things. Do you think it's a worrying thing for Australian politics?
I guess it's really sort of rewritten history because everyone had sort of written the states off, Neil. I think people had, sort of all the political sort of experts had said, the states really are always underneath the thumb of the Commonwealth because they've got the taxing powers. And I think we've seen a change dynamic. But just again, have a go at Scott Morrison. I'm afraid he's allowed that to happen. And the role of the Prime Minister and the federal government has been demeaned. It's been diminished. In terms of the balance of power in the Senate, to be very, very clear, what I'm trying to do is with other people in the Lib Dems team across the nation, we would like to get 3 or 4 senators up, and we want to provide some sense and leadership to the proceedings of government in this country. We don't want to see the waste and inefficiency. We won't back huge tax increases. We won't back things that curtail our freedoms, our liberty. And I could have stood as an independent, but that's why I'm running with the Liberal Democrats. Philosophically, I'm aligned to them, and I want to do this in a team.
Do you think it's doable, Campbell Newman? Have you got feedback from the public? How have you been treated since you've gotten out and about, since you've made the announcement?
Well, that's really interesting because, the last 6 years or so, I suppose the narrative has been that Campbell Newman was a persona non grata, to be frank. But I know that there's a lot of support out there. I get stopped by people all the time. I have over the last 6 years by people who greet me in regional settings as I go around the state of my business, and also in Queen Street and Brisbane. People say, look, we know what you were trying to do. You might have gone about it a bit too quickly, or you tried to do too much, but we know you were trying to put Queensland back on track. And they particularly worry about what's happened in the last 6.5 years, where they see us going backwards. They see a mountain of debt. They see poor administration. Look at our hospitals now. They've gone backwards. Look at all the scandals and the terrible stories coming out of Caboolture. Ambulance ramping's back. And I'm afraid the pandemic has not been well handled by Anastasia Palaszczuk, contrary to what some people try and say. Indeed, I don't think it's been well handled by Scott Morrison either.
That's former Liberal Queensland Premier, now Liberal Democrats Senate candidate for Queensland, Campbell Newman, giving it with both barrels blazing to both the major parties there. Well, from now until the next federal election, because the mainstream media probably won't give them much airtime, I'm going to keep an eye on what the minor parties have been up to every now and again. This election, due before May next year, is going to be like no other in Australian history, following the great divide in the country caused by COVID. And these minor parties have various important political positions and will have an increasing role to play in the Australian discourse, I think. The Liberal Democrats, with their sensible, balanced, classical liberal approach, are angry that the Liberal Party seems to have abandoned true liberalism. One Nation, with their traditional conservative approach, are angry that the Liberal and National parties have apparently abandoned conservatism altogether. And Clive Palmer, throwing the spanner in the works with his cash every now and again, just to stir things up. A bit like he did this week with his media conference that was just about completely ignored by the mainstream media, but not by us.
Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming. We meet today in a city known for its strength, in a country with citizens known for their courage. And we've never needed more courage and resilience with a crisis facing Australia. Today I want to just run through a few things which I think the public should be aware of and they're right to know. But before I do, I want to pay homage to Craig Kelly and the excellent leadership he's provided the nation. He's been the primary person responsible for what it is today, 46,000 Australians joining our party. And it's pretty clear that within the next month we'll have the largest membership of any political party in Australia. And certainly in my 50-year experience in politics as a former director of the Nationals, the Liberal Party, and a life member of those parties, I've never seen or experienced so many people join a party so quickly. I think when we set up the LNP, the most people that joined the party was 685 in one day. When Craig Kelly announced that he was our leader in the party, our membership went up by 5,000 people in 24 hours. So that's an indication that people in Australia are not happy. They're not happy with their politicians. They're not happy with what they're doing.
Okay, now I can't verify those numbers he's mentioned. We aren't resourced for that kind of fact-checking, unfortunately. But there's no doubt that he's right when he says a lot of Aussies are very unhappy with their mainstream politicians. This is going to be the election for the minor parties, and the election that will send a massive, much-needed wake-up call to the major parties and the overly empowered bureaucracy that really now runs Australia, enabled by the major parties, of course. Mr. Palmer then went on to speak about another issue. A report in the Sydney Morning Herald last week that Australia's medical regulator, the Therapeutic Goods Authority, the TGA, is preparing to take legal action against federal MP and leader of Clive Palmer's United Australia Party, Craig Kelly. Now, the Sydney Morning Herald says this is because of the infamous text message campaign that was backed by Mr. Palmer. The TGA says it could have misled millions of people about coronavirus vaccines. The Therapeutic Goods Administration head John Skerritt told the Sydney Morning Herald that he thinks the campaign broke copyright law and criminal law by using the TGA logo on a political party website conveying adverse event notifications in a way that tried to discourage people from getting vaccinated. Heaven forbid you should have the information you need to make your own mind up in this nanny state, but anyway. So, all of this freedom, relying on Australians to be intelligent, make their own minds up, it's got to be stopped. So the bureaucrats are a little apoplectic that they can't interfere and meddle and impose rules like they usually do on free speech between a political party and your telephone. This is what I love about Palmer. He's got the money to stir the pot. And boy, do our pollies and bureaucrats need a little stirring. Now, Mr. Palmer responded to the TGA boss at the news conference.
First of all, what was tweeted was a copy of the TGA's own report, which I think is all being circulated here. You've got a copy of it. It was a government report. So it's an extraordinary situation where you've got a member of the Australian House of Representatives being attacked for doing nothing more than circulating a government report. First of all, the United Australia Party welcomes any legal action against Mr. Kelly. We look forward to it as an opportunity when John Serrett himself can be subpoenaed, can be asked the questions about the 483 Australians that have died after having the vaccine, can be asked to say for the court and for the Australian people what were their causes of death and what did the TGA do to investigate that and why is it justified to continue the rollout. Secondly, we can ask Mr. Skerritt on oath about the 46,000 adverse reports that his office has received, about what he's done about it. And thirdly, we can raise the question of how he's threatened media owners with the cancellation of advertising if journalists publish anything to do with a contrary view of the government, and his attack on the freedom of speech. There'll also be a great opportunity to subpoena Greg Hunt, to bring him before the courts so he can explain his actions as a minister. Of course, Craig Kelly has nothing to fear from circulating an Australian government report. He has nothing to fear or be intimidated about the resources. He has the resources to defend himself. He has the resources to expose what's happening with the TGA. And a serious question's got to be asked with Mr. Skerritt, who's responsible for regulating drugs in this country. When we see him in a white coat on television promoting vaccines, is a serious conflict of interest between a regulator promoting a company's product. So we look forward to the United Australia Party with John Skerritt being true to his word, commencing a legal proceeding to allow the real relevant evidence to be brought before the court.
Okay, now again, we can't fact check those allegations, but we will bring you any further response from the TGA in future episodes. In the meantime, I can tell you that Professor Skerritt told ABC Radio's Richard Glover last week that the campaign was quite misleading because it gave people a long list of deaths that were not caused by vaccines.
Well, without the explanation, it's quite misleading. So what it says is that 495 people have had reports given to us that there was a death sometime, days or perhaps a week or so after they had a COVID vaccine. Now, as you know, thankfully more and more people every day are being vaccinated, and sadly in Australia 170,000 people die every year. 3,250 Australians die every single week. And so it's not surprising that 2 days after, say, a Pfizer vaccine, some people will die. The same way 2 days after going and seeing a doctor about something totally unrelated, they will die, or 2 days after catching a bus. So really, it's not the cause and effect thing. And when we've looked down at cause and effect, we believe that there's a total of 9 reports of death that can be associated to vaccines. And this is against a background of 20 million doses of vaccines being given in Australia.
Okay, so your figure is 9, and the one that Craig Kelly, in a way, is emphasising is 448. It's quite different.
Well, 495 is the current thing, but what they are is, out of an abundance of caution, either individual doctors or hospitals are saying, look, so-and-so died 5 days after having AstraZeneca or Pfizer. Can you look into it? And we look into all those cases, and as I said, only 9 do we believe, and we use an independent panel of experts to help us. Only 9 do we believe that there's a cause and effect relationship. In the other cases, they were things like strokes, and sadly people die in hospital or even at home of strokes every day of the year, or all other sorts of causes of death. And when you have 3,000 people dying every week of a year, and especially with vaccines being given among older people, it's not surprising that coincidentally there are hundreds of people who sadly die within days of being vaccinated.
And this is the problem with the scary stories we see from the real anti-vaxxers, the hardcore anti-vaxxers. Most people, especially journalists, don't understand that correlation, which means two things are happening at the same time, does not equal causation, one thing causing the other thing, or this thing causing that thing, just because they happen at the same time, right? Now, it's a sign always when you get correlation that you might want to go looking for a causal link, right? Make sure there isn't one, but it absolutely doesn't mean that there was one. 9 deaths out of 20 million doses, while tragic, isn't grounds to abandon a vaccine when you weigh it up against the illness that the vaccine will present. You know, even 500 deaths, if they were all attributable to the vaccine, even 500 might not be enough to say we need to not do this. Okay, don't shoot me, all right, for saying that, but that's just the science and the statistical reality of that if you're going to look at it and you accept the mainstream science. I know a lot of people out there who watch this show don't. It's your choice. This is a free country. So the only person with the sovereign right to decide whether you want to take the risk of getting vaccinated, no matter how small, is you. Not a government, not your boss, not a shopkeeper, not an airline. Especially when we know that the risk posed by an unvaccinated person to a vaccinated person is so small as to be negligible. Our intrepid volunteer researcher, Alison Hallier, found this. This is a UK government report on COVID, the technical briefing number 20, dated August the 6th. And it says on page 35, the NHS test and trace case data for all cases with Delta are similar, with a median of 17.8 for the unvaccinated and 18.0 for those with 2 vaccine doses. This means that whilst vaccine may reduce an individual's overall risk of becoming infected, once they are infected, there is limited difference in viral load between those who are vaccinated and unvaccinated. Given they have similar values, this suggests limited difference in infectiousness. So, why the crazy bureaucratic obsession with getting everybody vaccinated? Part of it is the fact that you are less likely to catch COVID in the first place if you're vaccinated, but only at about 39%. And that's only per interaction. So if you bump into about 4 or 5 people that are infected, the chances are you're going to get it. And a lot of the medical scientific consensus now is that just about everybody's going to get Delta. It's that contagious. So unvaccinated or not, you're going to get it. And once you've got it, you are no less infectious to other people if you are vaccinated. But there's a whole other reason why our governments are so obsessed about everybody getting vaccinated. I spoke to some public health doctors this past week, and the reason is politics. It's not the unvaxxed people that we should be shaming. It's our pollies and the nurses and medical unions who've let things get this bad. Our hospitals simply cannot cope. If we have a few thousand hospitalisations in an Australian state like Western Australia, South Australia, Victoria or Queensland, we are stuffed, according to the doctors, because we are simply not ready. Our ICU, our intensive care unit system, is designed to run almost at 100% capacity in peacetime. So in wartime or pandemic time, it can't cope. So why haven't they been building special annex wards and getting ventilators in and getting ready and increasing capacity? I mean, they've had 18 months, right? Well, that is a little more complex. A lack of political will is one reason. Lousy leadership and terrible management in the bureaucracy of our health departments is another. But why the lack of leadership? Why the lack of political will? Fear. Fear of who? The unions, the Nurses Union and the Australian Medical Association, the Doctors Union, are capable of bringing premiers down. We don't have the staff to run the ventilators in the ICU wards, even if we did build them. So here we are, trying to get up to 80 to 90% vaccination, not for the science, not because the unvaccinated pose a risk to the vaccinated directly, but because the unvaccinated might not be able to get treatment. The vaccinated who need it, who still get serious COVID, also might not be able to get treatment. And other people who need an ICU bed and nursing for other reasons won't be able to get treatment. And for that reason, people will die. So let's stop blaming and shaming the unvaxxed. It's actually not their fault. Let's blame the bureaucrats and the unions and the gutless, mostly Labor politicians who've been too chicken to do the right thing during and before COVID to make our hospital system better. So who's the worst? Well, look at the states with the worst ambulance ramping, the states that can't cope even with normal hospital needs. And now you see Mark McGowan's craziness shut the border, and Anastasia's heartlessness locking children away from their parents and stopping cancer patients from getting treatment, and Dan's arrogance and Gladys's abandonment of liberal principles all start to make a whole lot more sense. People will die, not so much from COVID, but because of their mismanagement and union control of our country. If you ever needed proof that leftism kills, that big government socialism results in very bad outcomes and death and suffering and cover-ups, this, my friends, is it. I will never accept that any government has the right to force or coerce you to get vaccinated. And you could take other measures to protect yourself from COVID and stay safe if we had hospital nursing capacity. But given where we are right now, in terms of the fact that we have to open up in November and December, that Delta will spread fast through the community, and given the terrible unpreparedness of our hospitals, I think the risk of dying from not being able to access the right treatment is greater than dying from a COVID vaccine. And for that reason, I say to those of you still resisting vaccination, maybe reconsider getting the jab. Protect yourself from our socialist healthcare system. Socialism always leads to one thing: a market that serves the average workers in the business before it serves the customers. Exceptional doctors and nurses and teachers exist, of course, but under socialism, they usually get no more pay than the bad ones. Free market liberalism with strong competition means that the customers are looked after first, and the workers are looked after too in the fight between businesses for the best staff, but only if they serve the customers well. And that, my friends, is why I am a free market liberal and will never be a socialist. You want to look after people, if you really care about human beings and their health and their welfare and their well-being, liberalism, not socialism, ever. And just one final note on that story. Isn't it funny how when it comes to vaccine adverse events, the authorities are so quick to point out the reality that, yes, correlation doesn't equal causation. But when it comes to COVID cases or COVID deaths, every respiratory death and pneumonia case and flu case that happens gets recorded as a potential COVID death. Make up your mind, folks. You can't have it both ways. Well, there's a very interesting defamation ruling by the High Court this week, which has got everybody in a bit of a flap, because effectively what it does is make everybody liable for the things that other people might put in comments underneath their posts. So it could be, anybody who's got a media outlet or anybody who's got a manager's page for an organization could find themselves at risk of being sued for defamation simply because of something that a complete stranger decides to post in their comments. At least that's my understanding of it. We're going to get a very clear legal understanding of it now from Queensland barrister stuck in the Australian Capital Territory at the moment, thanks to border closures, Dr. Gillian Dempsey. Welcome back to The Other Side, Gillian.
Thank you very much, Damian.
So, Gillian, this is an unusual ruling, and it could you just explain to us why the High Court was ruling on this and what the underlying matter was?
Well, actually, it was a very predictable ruling. In fact, it follows on from a chain of precedent, and particularly High Court precedent, where it's previously held Google liable for defamation as a publisher. And what happened in this instance was that Mr. Voller and Fairfax had each agreed that they were going to have a pre-hearing of a particular matter of law as to whether or not Fairfax was a publisher. And so instead of having the whole case heard and whether there was defamatory imputations and whether there was any kind of defences, they wanted to hear this separated and isolated incidents first. And so that went to the Court of Appeal in New South Wales, and then it went to the High Court to hear that matter first. I think it's very unusual in respect of, if I were for Fairfax, I would not have wanted to have set precedent on this, because we already had the precedent coming from a case which I find very hard to pronounce because I'm terrible at names. It's Trulja, and Google, it's Trkulja, and Google, which was from 2018 in the High Court. Now, that case said that Google was a publisher because it had a particular algorithm which identified Mr. Trulja as effectively an underworld figure in Melbourne because he'd been shot in the back. And so he was always there in pictures of search Melbourne underworld, and he would pop up in the images. He was not at all happy with that. And so that was a precedent for this. And in this instance, what we have is that there was comments on a Facebook page made by people who we don't even know who they are necessarily, because you don't have to be the person you're meant to be on Facebook. And they were allegedly defamatory because the matter hasn't been heard yet of Mr. Voller. And I think that this case was quite straightforward, because joining the dots of Trulja and this, it was necessary for the High Court to be consistent with itself to rule that they were a publisher, Fairfax was a publisher on Facebook. Now, interestingly, a number of other news entities have tried to water this down. They tried to say, "Oh no, it wouldn't be applying to non-commercial news entities, like, for example, the ABC." And they've said, "Well, it won't apply to individuals." And I'm afraid they're wrong on that. It will apply to individuals who have Facebook pages, because normal defamation law does apply to them, and the principle is the same. If you are somebody who is making something published, and you are the owner of the account, you're going to be held responsible for that. And it'll work effectively for Instagram, where you get to control the comments. It'll work for Facebook, where you get to control the comments. It'll work for your blogs. It'll even work for this podcast.
So, Gillian, what does this mean for the people at home watching now who are wondering, gosh, have I got to monitor every single thing that somebody writes on my post? And what happens if I get, into trouble? What do I do?
Well, generally speaking, I would say it's wise to monitor what people are saying in response to your posts, especially if you're in a flame war with somebody else. You don't want your friends coming in behind you and making things worse for you. So I would urge moderation on them. It's not particularly good for freedom of speech, but on the other hand, getting a concerns notice is not very good either. If you were to receive a concerns notice, you would have to pay very close attention to the wording of that, and most concerns notices would require you to go and find a defamation lawyer. I can say honestly that if you go and get yourself a conveyancing lawyer or any other normal kind of lawyer, they are not going to know what to do with it, and they will make a dreadful mess of it, in my experience. So your options are either to do what it says or to go and find a defamation specialist.
Okay. Most of the time, it's going to be too expensive to find a defamation specialist for some people. But if you just do what it says, then are you then protected, or?
Yeah, if you do what it says in the concerns notice, it's usually go and take this thing down. This thing's distressing me because it's not correct and it's a lie, and here's why it's not true. I've noticed that there are some people who dig in and they They won't move. I think that there's a matter on at the moment where Mr. Barilaro is currently suing somebody who has dug in and won't move in relation
Friendly
to
Geordies?
Friendly Geordies, yes. And I would say that sometimes digging in and not moving is a very difficult position to put yourself in, because now that you'll be liable not only for what you've said, but for what everybody else underneath you have said, that kind of adds a lot of aggravating factors into the damages that you could be liable to pay.
So basically, we're all now responsible for everything that anybody comments on any post that we make. Is that right?
To a certain degree. And the interesting point will be on Twitter, because on Twitter, we can't delete comments. Right. We aren't able to delete other people's comments. We can delete our comment, but the remainder of the comments will remain there. We can ask Twitter to get rid of it, but there's going to be a bit of a conflict, because in the US, they have the First Amendment. We don't have the First Amendment. And Twitter will go, well, I don't think that there's anything there that needs to be taken down. Nothing to see here. We're going to leave it. So you'll have a bit of a conflict between Australian and US law in relation to Twitter. And that'll be a matter which will have to be determined by the courts. But I would just generally say that you're not going to be sued immediately.
Well, that's nice.
There's a thing, I know, it's always helpful to know. There's a thing called a concerns notice that goes out, which warns you about somebody having been upset by something that's been said or something that's been written. And then when you receive the concerns notice, it will have to articulate very carefully exactly what they say was defamatory, why it was defamatory, and it'll have to ask for what remedy it wants. And usually it's going to be take the thing down, get rid of it. The problem is, and it's often referred to as a King Canute problem, King Canute trying to hold back the tide. Once you've published something online, it just travels. People republish it, they retweet it, they recast it, they comment on a comment of a comment. And so the question is going to be, in that chain of comments, who's going to be a publisher?
Yeah. Okay.
So there's multiple publications that are going to spread out like ripples on a tide.
Right. So basically this extends, this is one of those situations where the High Court's legal ruling is technically accurate for consistency, as you said, but totally. The practicality is going to be a very different question. Yes. Australia's defamation laws basically state that publishers are responsible for what they publish. So by denoting that anybody who posts on your thread is being published by you, that means that you are liable for everything everybody says. The practicality of that, of course, is that if I wanted to attack somebody or have them potentially sued with defamation, I could just post under a pseudonym or a sock puppet, as they call them on Twitter, something defamatory and pop it up on their thread, and then they would be responsible for that.
That's oddly enough the first thing that my cousin Peter said to me when I told him about this outcome. He said, I think that there are a number of people that might want to be in trouble. I'll have to hook into my VPN. Right. The part of the decision was a question of whether the defense in defamation law of innocent dissemination meant that, by analogy, that Fairfax was not a publisher. The defence of innocent dissemination has always been there in libel, particularly for people such as newsagents who are selling magazines. They don't know what's in the magazine. The typical cases, for example, are an English bookseller selling books in French. They have no idea what the content is, whether it's defamatory or not. They can't even read them. And so
what is it? Innocent
dissemination. Yeah, the innocent disseminator, section 32 of the Uniform Defamation Act. So all have that in there. But of course, there's a bit of a problem because, once again, we have the concerns notice. So if you receive a concerns notice, you now know that that's upset somebody. And so your choices are either do whatever it says in the notice or contact a lawyer, and probably then do whatever it says in the notice. It's just that it's an expensive way around to find out that you've defamed somebody. Part of the problem of freedom of speech, I guess, in Australia versus America is that the American laws require you to be deliberately defaming people, intending to hurt their feelings when you defame them. Australian law does not require that at all. All it requires is publication. We use any kind of intention as what we call an aggravating factor for aggravated damages. So you can get kind of, I won't call them punishing damages, but they really, in effect, as far as we understand them as laymen, are punishing damages.
Yeah.
And it's any kind of hurt that you intend to cause will be very obvious from the words that are chosen in most situations. And so in Australia, you can just cause $800,000 worth of harm accidentally. In the US, you can't do it at all.
Right. So in Australia, it's been a while since I was at journalism school and studied defamation law, but the laws are now pretty consistent around the country, or do we still have very
we have a uniform set of laws. I mean, we have had different precedents in relation to this kind of area. For example, we had precedents leading up to this decision. We had Duffy and Google, which was South Australia. We had Chukulia and Google, which was in 2018, which is the High Court coming out of Victoria. And of course, we had an outlier in Blyer and Google, which was Justice McCallan's decision in New South Wales in 2014, which went back the other way. I'd say now that Blyer is probably not good law.
So what was the essence of Blyer?
The essence of Blyer was effectively that they said that it was not going to constitute a publication. People don't know what is defamatory to start with. They don't know that mere abuse, like calling somebody, you can beep it out, is just abuse. If you start calling them pedophile, on the other hand, you've run into defamatory ground. If you call them evil, if you call them dishonest, that's defamatory. But if you just say, they're ugly or stupid or whatever, that's not defamatory, not usually.
Right. Okay.
So
and
they'll probably be weeding out the wrong comments.
If they're politicians or public figures, is there protection for those criticising politicians, or does it
to a certain degree? Actually, that's been slightly eased back by the decision in Lionholme and Hanson Young. It's basically decided that if you are saying something that is defamatory in the context of one politician attacking another, that what I had anticipated was the Longy defence, the Longy privilege of political free speech does not necessarily always apply. And so you're going to have to be very cautious with that, because I think that, as you would already know, especially during lockdown, that defamation and concerns notices are a cottage industry. They'll be putting my child through university.
Okay.
And the politicians will send out so many, and you'll see the apologies pop up in all the major newspapers time and time again. I'm sorry that this was said about this politician. So nobody really wants to push that one too hard, because they don't know exactly what the scope of the Longy privilege is, because you have to test it each time.
So I'd just like to say on the other side right now that, all our politicians are brilliant, wonderful people, exceptional, doing a fantastic job, and we couldn't ask for more, really. And if we just all say that, then everything will be fine.
Well, my junior master, who used to have all of the different news agencies, he was effectively almost on retainer from them, always told me that the one word that does not carry any negative connotation is unlovely. And I'll say politicians by and large are unlovely.
Unlovely. They are unlovely. By and large unlovely.
Unlovely. I think it really sums it all up. You can say that somebody's unlovely because it's been found not to carry any connotation that anyone can make any sense of.
Oh boy. Okay. Well, Gillian, thank you very, very much for taking the time to talk to us. Really appreciate it. And we look forward to seeing you again, hopefully soon.
Thank you, Damian.
Hi, this is Damian Coory. If you enjoyed this episode of The Other Side Australia, the best way that you can support us is by telling your friends about the show and liking, sharing, and subscribing, including hitting the bell on as many platforms as possible. To find us, simply search up The Other Side Australia or Discernible with an A on YouTube. YouTube is the best place to go. When you get to the Discernible platform, the Discernible channel on YouTube, you'll see playlists for the different Discernible shows, and there's a playlist for The Other Side Australia, which has all of our or most of our past episodes, as well as always the most recent episodes at the top. So that's YouTube, Discernible with an A, Discernable, and you're looking for the playlist of The Other Side Australia, and you'll find it right there on Discernible. You can sign up for that playlist and alerts on that playlist by just hitting subscribe and the bell, or to all the Discernible content. And you'll catch us every single time. They'll let you know when we put up new content. Now, you can also follow us for the audio show, the podcast show. It's just the audio version of this show on Apple, Spotify, iHeartRadio, all the great audio podcast platforms. We are on all of them. And if you really want to keep in touch and avoid the big tech censors, just send us an email to theothersideost@gmail.com. theothersideost@gmail.com. Ask to be added to the VIP WhatsApp group, and I will send you back a link that enables you to join or unjoin. You have total control the WhatsApp group that we have. Now, the WhatsApp group is a one-way group, so you're not going to get bombarded with people having discussions about things. All we do is send one or two messages or so a week, letting you know that the new show is out with a link to the show. And occasionally we might send a little bit of information, but generally you're not going to get more than 2 or 3 messages on WhatsApp per week if you sign up to our WhatsApp group. So just drop me that email at theothersideost@gmail.com. And I strongly recommend signing up to the Discernible crew as well for the platform, for Matthew's shows, all the other content that we have on Discernible at discernible.io. Bit of an unusual suffix there, not .com or .org, but it's .io. And it's Discernible with an A. Catch you soon.